The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as thousands of tourists gathered for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Margaret Chen, a 67-year-old retired teacher from Vancouver, clutching her camera with trembling hands. This trip to London had been her late husband David's dream, one they had planned together for 40 years of marriage before cancer took him away 6 months ago. Margaret had almost canceled the trip 3 times. The empty seat beside her on the plane, the single hotel room, the tourist attractions meant for 2, everything reminded her of David's absence. But her daughter Lisa had insisted she go. "Dad would want you to see the world, Mom. He'd be heartbroken if you stayed locked up in that house forever." Now, standing in the crowd of excited tourists, Margaret felt more alone than ever. Families posed for photos, couples shared quiet moments, and groups of friends laughed together. She pulled David's old travel journal from her purse, the one where he had written detailed notes about all the places they would visit together. His handwriting, still so familiar, brought tears to her eyes. The ceremonial music began, and the famous red-coated guards marched into formation. Their tall black bearskin hats bobbed in perfect rhythm, their movements precise and mechanical. Margaret watched through her camera lens, trying to capture moments that David would never see, but her hands shook too much to take steady pictures. The grief hit her in waves, sometimes manageable, sometimes overwhelming like this moment. Standing at his post near the palace gates was Guardsman James Mitchell, a 24-year-old soldier from Manchester who had been serving with the Coldstream Guards for 3 years. To the tourists, he was just another stoic figure in red, standing perfectly still with his rifle. But behind the rigid facade, James was fighting his own private battle. 3 weeks earlier, James had received devastating news. His younger brother Tommy, his best friend, and the person he loved most in the world, had been diagnosed with leukemia. Tommy was only 19, just starting university, with his whole life ahead of him. The doctor said the treatment would be long and difficult, with no guarantees. James hadn't been able to get leave to visit Tommy yet. Military duty came first, and the tourist season meant all guards were needed. Every day he stood at his post, maintaining the perfect military bearing that was expected of him. While inside, he worried constantly about his little brother lying in a hospital bed 200 miles away. As the ceremony continued, Margaret found herself drifting closer to where James stood guard. She wasn't paying attention to the changing of positions or the tourist guidelines about maintaining distance from the guards. Her mind was lost in memories of David, of all the conversations they'd had about this moment, about seeing the famous guards who never broke their composure no matter what happened around them. Other tourists snapped photos and made jokes, trying to get the guards to react. But Margaret just stood there, tears streaming down her cheeks, completely overwhelmed by the weight of experiencing this alone. She thought about David's excitement when they'd watched documentaries about the royal guards, how he'd practiced standing at attention in their living room, making her laugh with his exaggerated military posture. James noticed the elderly woman, standing near his post. At first, she was just another tourist in the crowd, but something about her caught his attention. While others were animated and excited, she stood quietly, and he could see she was crying. In his peripheral vision, he watched her pull out a small notebook and hold it against her chest like it contained something precious. The woman reminded him of his own grandmother, who had raised him and Tommy after their parents died in a car accident when James was 12. Grandmother Mitchell had been their rock, working 2 jobs to keep them fed and housed, never complaining about the burden of raising 2 grieving boys. She had passed away just before James joined the military, but not before seeing him graduate and knowing he would take care of Tommy. Margaret's legs felt weak. The emotion of the moment, combined with the jet lag and the fact that she had barely eaten that morning, made her dizzy. She took a step backward, trying to steady herself, but the crowd behind her was thick. She stumbled, her purse falling open, scattering David's travel journals, their old photos, and her medication across the ground. Panic set in as strangers' feet came dangerously close to stepping on the precious photos. Margaret dropped to her knees, frantically trying to gather the scattered memories. A picture of her and David on their wedding day lay just inches from a tourist's shoe. Another photo from their 25th anniversary was being blown by the wind toward a puddle. The crowd around her seemed oblivious to her distress. People continued taking pictures, chatting excitedly and jostling for better positions to see the guards. Margaret felt invisible in her moment of crisis, just like she had felt invisible in her grief for the past 6 months. David had always been the outgoing one, the one who made friends easily and drew people to them. Without him, she felt like she was disappearing. James watched the scene unfold, his training warring with his human instincts. Royal guards were taught to remain motionless and focused regardless of what happened around them. Tourists often tried to distract them with various antics, and maintaining composure was part of the job. Breaking position could result in serious disciplinary action, but this wasn't someone trying to get a reaction for a funny photo. This was a person in genuine distress, and everything about the situation reminded him of his grandmother's vulnerability in her final years. He could see the woman's hands shaking as she tried to collect what appeared to be precious photographs, and the way other tourists nearly stepped on her belongings made his chest tight with anger and sympathy. The wind picked up another photo, sending it skittering across the courtyard. Margaret let out a small cry of despair. That picture showed David feeding pigeons in Trafalgar Square during their only previous trip to London 20 years ago. It was irreplaceable, and she watched, helplessly as it tumbled away from her reach, knowing she would never be able to chase it down in time. James watched the photograph tumble across the stone courtyard, his heart pounding beneath his rigid military exterior. Every instinct screamed at him to help, but years of training held him frozen in position. Royal guards didn't break formation. They didn't react. They especially didn't abandon their posts for tourists, no matter how distressing the situation appeared. But as the precious photo rolled toward a storm drain, James made a decision that would change everything. In one fluid movement, he stepped away from his position, bent down, and caught the photograph just before it disappeared forever. The entire courtyard seemed to freeze. Hundreds of tourists stopped talking, stopped taking pictures, stopped moving entirely. Even the other guards glanced over in shock. Margaret looked up from where she knelt on the ground, her tear-filled eyes meeting James's for the first time. In that moment, both of them saw something that transcended their roles as tourist and guard, as strangers from different worlds. Margaret saw a young man with kind eyes who had just saved something irreplaceable to her. James saw his own grandmother's face reflected in this elderly woman's grief. Without saying a word, James knelt beside Margaret and began helping her gather the scattered photographs and papers. His large, gloved hands moved carefully among the precious memories, treating each item like it was made of glass. Other tourists started to murmur, some taking pictures of this unprecedented scene, others simply watching in stunned silence. Margaret's hands were shaking so badly she could barely pick up the items. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. "These are all I have left of him." James didn't respond verbally. He wasn't supposed to speak while on duty, but his gentle handling of her belongings spoke volumes. As they gathered the photos together, Margaret found herself looking at each one as if seeing them for the first time. Here was David at their son's graduation, beaming with pride. There he was teaching their granddaughter to ride a bicycle, running alongside her with his hand on the seat. Each image represented a moment of joy that felt impossibly far away now. James noticed the dates on some of the photos, spanning decades of what was clearly a long and happy marriage. His own grandmother had kept similar collections, treasured memories of his grandfather who had died in the Korean War. He understood the weight of these objects, how they became lifelines when loss threatened to drown you. Other tourists began to realize something extraordinary was happening. Instead of the usual tourist spectacle of trying to make the guards react, they were witnessing genuine human compassion. Some started putting away their cameras out of respect. Others moved closer, wanting to help but unsure how to approach the situation. A middle-aged man from Germany stepped forward. "Excuse me. I think this belongs to you," he said gently, holding out another photograph that had blown near his feet. Soon other tourists were joining in, creating a small circle of people helping to recover Margaret's scattered memories. The atmosphere shifted from typical tourist chaos to something quieter, more reverent. Margaret couldn't believe what was happening. For months, she had felt invisible in her grief. Friends and family, despite their good intentions, often seemed uncomfortable around her sadness. They wanted her to move on or feel better, as if grief operated on some predetermined timeline. But here, surrounded by strangers, she felt truly seen for the first time since David's death. James carefully stacked the recovered photographs, making sure they were in order and undamaged. As he handed them back to Margaret, their eyes met. Again. She saw something in his expression that surprised her. He wasn't just being polite or doing his duty. There was genuine understanding there, as if he too knew what it felt like to carry heavy sadness while the world expected you to remain strong. "My husband would have loved this place," Margaret said softly, not sure if James could even acknowledge her words. "We planned this trip for 40 years. He was fascinated by the royal guards, by the discipline and the history." Her voice caught. "I almost didn't come. It felt wrong to see all the places we dreamed about without him." James listened intently, while maintaining his professional bearing. Something about her story resonated deeply with him. He thought about Tommy in the hospital, about all the plans they had made together that might never happen now. He understood the guilt of experiencing things alone that were meant to be shared. The crowd around them had grown larger, but it remained respectfully quiet. Word was spreading through the tourist groups about what was happening. People were pulling out their phones, but instead of taking pictures for entertainment, they were recording what felt like a moment of genuine human connection in an increasingly disconnected world. Margaret slowly got to her feet, clutching her recovered treasures. "I don't know how to thank you," she said to James, and then to the other tourists who had helped. "I thought I had lost him all over again when I saw these blowing away." One of the German tourists, an elderly man about Margaret's age, approached her carefully. "I lost my wife 2 years ago," he said quietly. "I understand how precious these memories are. May I ask, what was your husband's name?" "David," Margaret replied, surprised by the question. "David Chen. He was a history teacher. He would have been so excited to talk to you about this ceremony, about the traditions." The German man smiled sadly. "My Anna would have done the same thing. She collected stories from everyone we met while traveling. I think she would have liked David very much." More people began sharing quiet words with Margaret. A young mother mentioned that her own grandmother had similar photographs from her late grandfather. An older couple from Australia talked about how they had almost canceled their trip after the husband's heart attack, but decided their dreams were too important to give up. James watched this spontaneous community form around Margaret's grief, and something tight in his chest began to loosen. For weeks he had been carrying his worry about Tommy alone, feeling isolated by military protocol and the expectation that guards were somehow above human emotion. But seeing these strangers connect over shared loss and hope reminded him that vulnerability wasn't weakness. Margaret looked back at James, who had returned to a more formal position but was still clearly engaged with the situation. "You know," she said, loud enough for him to hear, David always said that the most important thing about traveling wasn't seeing famous places, but meeting the people who make those places special. I think I finally understand what he meant. The ceremony around them continued, but the energy had shifted entirely. Tourists were more respectful, more aware of the human beings behind the uniforms and the ceremonies. What had started as a moment of personal crisis had become something larger. A reminder that underneath all the roles people play, everyone carries their own struggles and hopes. The crowd around Margaret and James continued to grow, but the atmosphere remained surprisingly gentle and respectful. Word of the guard's compassionate act was spreading through the courtyard in whispers and nudges, drawing people who wanted to witness something genuine in a world that often felt scripted and artificial. Margaret found herself surrounded by faces from around the world, tourists from Japan, Brazil, India, South Africa, all drawn together by this unexpected moment of human connection. She realized she was no longer crying from grief alone, but from something more complex: gratitude, surprise, and the strange comfort of being understood by strangers. A young woman from Brazil approached Margaret tentatively. "Excuse me, Senora, but I wanted to tell you something. My grandmother, she passed last month, and I am traveling with her ashes to scatter in the places she always dreamed of visiting. Your story, it touches my heart very much." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small wooden box carved with intricate flowers. "This is her, traveling with me. She would want me to tell you that love like yours, it never really disappears." Margaret's eyes filled with fresh tears, but they were different now. Warmer, less sharp with pain. "What was her name?" she asked. "Maria Santos. She was a seamstress who saved every penny for 60 years to take this trip. She died 1 week before we were supposed to leave together." The young woman, who introduced herself as Carmen, smiled through her own tears. "But I brought her anyway. She is seeing everything through my eyes." James listened to these exchanges while maintaining his post, but his usual rigid composure was softening. He thought about his grandmother's funeral, how he had stood at attention in his dress uniform while inside he was breaking apart. Military training taught you to compartmentalize emotions, to function despite personal pain, but it didn't teach you how to process loss or find comfort in community. An elderly Japanese man stepped forward, bowing slightly to Margaret. "In my culture, we believe that when someone dies, they become part of the wind, the rain, the sunshine. You're David. He is here with you now, seeing this beautiful moment through your eyes, feeling proud that his wife is so brave to travel alone." Margaret clutched David's journal tighter. "I don't feel brave," she admitted. "I feel terrified most of the time. Everything reminds me of him, but everything also reminds me that he's gone." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," said a voice from behind her. Margaret turned to see a woman in her 50s wearing a nurse's uniform under her jacket. "I'm Sarah. I work at a hospice in London. I was just finishing my night shift and stopped to see the ceremony before going home. Courage is doing the things that scare you because they matter. Your husband would be so proud that you came here despite your fear." The conversation was drawing attention from tourists throughout the courtyard. People were putting away their cameras and actually talking to each other, sharing stories instead of just taking pictures. The usual competitive atmosphere of trying to get the perfect shot was replaced by something more meaningful. James found himself thinking about Tommy again, but for the first time in weeks, the thoughts weren't purely worried. Tommy would love hearing about this moment. His little brother had always been fascinated by how strangers could become friends over shared experiences. Even in the hospital, Tommy had been making friends with other patients, collecting their stories, finding humor and hope in the darkest situations. A tour guide who had been leading a group of American tourists approached the gathering. At first, Margaret tensed, expecting to be moved along or scolded for disrupting the ceremony. Instead, The guide, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, said, "I've been doing these tours for 15 years and I've never seen anything like this. Would you mind if I told other tour groups about what happened here? Not for photos or publicity, but because I think people need to hear stories about kindness." Margaret looked around at all the faces watching her expectantly. A few months ago, this attention would have terrified her. David had always been the social one, the storyteller, the person who could talk to anyone. But something about this moment, about the genuine interest and compassion of these strangers, made her feel brave in a way she hadn't experienced since before David got sick. "David was a teacher," she said, her voice growing stronger. "He believed that every person you meet has a story worth hearing. He would want me to share our story if it helps someone else feel less alone." She paused, looking directly at James, who was still maintaining his post, but clearly listening to every word. "And he would want me to thank the young man who saved our memories from blowing away." The crowd turned to look at James, who remained in his formal position, but couldn't hide the emotion in his eyes. An older man in the crowd, clearly a veteran based on his military bearing and the medals on his jacket, stepped forward. "Son," the veteran said to James, "I served in the Royal Navy for 30 years. I know the rules about breaking position, and I know the consequences you might face for what you did. But I also know that sometimes being a good soldier means being a good human being first. What you did today honored your uniform more than standing rigid ever could." Other voices joined in agreement. The tourists, who had started as passive observers of a ceremony, were now active participants in something far more meaningful. They were witnessing and contributing to a moment of genuine human connection that transcended cultural boundaries, military protocol, and the typical tourist experience. Margaret realized that her hands had stopped shaking for the first time in months. The constant anxiety that had gripped her since David's death seemed to have loosened its hold. She wasn't cured of grief. That wasn't how loss worked, but she felt less alone in carrying it. "You know what David would say if he were here?" she announced to the group. "He'd say that this guard didn't break protocol, he fulfilled it. The real job of protecting people isn't just about standing guard over buildings. Sometimes it's about protecting what matters most to people, even if it's just old photographs." A spontaneous round of applause began, starting with the veteran and spreading through the crowd. But it wasn't the kind of applause that performers receive. It was the kind that communities give to recognize something important, something worth celebrating. James felt his cheeks redden under his bearskin hat, but for the first time in weeks, he also felt something that had been missing: pride in his service that went beyond just following orders. The ceremony around them was officially concluding, but nobody in the crowd seemed interested in leaving. They had found something more valuable than the scheduled tourist attraction. They had found each other, and in doing so, had created a moment that would stay with each of them long after. They returned to their regular lives. As the formal ceremony concluded and the other guards began their march back to the barracks, James faced a difficult decision. Protocol demanded that he return to his duties immediately, but something about this moment felt too important to simply walk away from. He could see that Margaret was still surrounded by the impromptu community that had formed around her story, and he sensed that his presence had meant something significant to her. Making another unprecedented decision, James approached his sergeant, who had been watching the entire scene with a mixture of concern and curiosity. The conversation was brief and conducted in hushed military tones, but Margaret could see James gesturing toward her and the group of tourists. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the sergeant nodded grimly and walked away. James returned to where Margaret stood, removing his bearskin hat for the first time, revealing a young face marked by both kindness and worry. The crowd fell silent, recognizing that something important was about to happen. "Ma'am," James said quietly, his voice carrying a Manchester accent that made him seem more human than the silent statue he had been minutes before. "I wanted to properly introduce myself. I'm Guardsman James Mitchell, And I need you to know that what happened here today meant more to me than you could possibly understand." Margaret felt her heart skip. After months of feeling like she was speaking into a void, here was someone actually responding to her story. "I'm Margaret Chen," she replied, "and you saved more than just photographs today. You saved pieces of my husband, pieces of our life together." James glanced around at the gathered tourists, then made another decision that went against his training. "Mrs. Chen, would it be possible to speak with you privately for just a moment? There's something I'd like to share with you if you're willing to listen." The crowd respectfully gave them space, though they remained close enough to witness this extraordinary conversation. Margaret nodded, clutching David's journal against her chest like a lifeline. "3 weeks ago," James began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I received news that my younger brother has leukemia. He's 19, just started university, and he's the only family I have left. Every day I stand at this post, I think about him lying in a hospital bed, going through treatments alone because I can't get leave to visit him yet." Margaret's eyes filled with understanding. "What's his name?" "Tommy. Thomas Mitchell. He's always been the stronger one between us, even though I'm the big brother. When our parents died in a car accident, he was the one who helped me through it. He made jokes when I cried. He convinced me to join the military when I was lost. He celebrated harder than anyone when I made it into the Guards." James's voice cracked slightly. "And now he's facing this fight, and I can't be there for him the way he was there for me." Margaret reached out instinctively and placed her hand on James's arm. "You know, David was sick for 8 months before he died. Cancer too, though a different kind. The hardest part wasn't the treatments or even knowing we were losing time. The hardest part was feeling like I had to be strong every moment, like I couldn't fall apart because he needed me to be his rock." James nodded, recognizing the weight she described. "That's exactly it. Everyone expects me to be this unshakable soldier, standing perfectly still no matter what's happening in my life. But when I saw you today, struggling to save those photographs, all I could think about was how my grandmother would have wanted someone to help her in a moment like that." "Your grandmother raised you?" Margaret asked, sensing there was more to his story. "After our parents died, yes. She worked 2 jobs to keep us fed and housed, never complained, never let us feel like we were burdens. She died just before I joined the military, but not before she made me promise to take care of Tommy." James looked down at his hands. "I feel like I'm failing her, failing him, by being stuck here in ceremony while he's fighting for his life." Margaret was quiet for a moment, thinking about all the times she had felt guilty for continuing to live while David was dying, for finding moments of joy or distraction when she should have been focused entirely on him. "James, can I tell you something David used to say when he was going through chemotherapy?" James nodded eagerly, hungry for any wisdom that might ease his burden. "He said that love isn't about being physically present every moment. Love is about carrying someone in your heart so completely that they're with you even when they're not in the room. Every day you stand at this post, thinking about Tommy, worrying about him, planning what you'll say when you see him. That's love in action. That's being a good brother." The words hit James like a revelation. For weeks, he had been consumed by guilt about not being at Tommy's bedside, as if physical presence was the only way to show he cared. But Margaret's perspective offered a different way of understanding devotion. "When David was too sick to travel, he used to make me describe everything I saw when I went out. The color of the sky, the people I met, the conversations I overheard. He said it was like seeing the world through my eyes." Margaret smiled through her tears. "Maybe Tommy needs you to be out here, living your life, having experiences you can share with him. Maybe your strength comes from knowing that you're building stories to tell him." Around them, the tourist crowd had grown even larger as word of this conversation spread. But instead of the typical tourist behavior of photographing everything, people were simply listening, recognizing that they were witnessing something rare and precious. Carmen, the young Brazilian woman carrying her grandmother's ashes, stepped forward. "Excuse me, but I couldn't help overhearing. When my grandmother was dying, she made me promise not to put my life on hold for her death. She said the greatest gift I could give her was to live fully, to experience joy, to meet people and collect stories. She said grief should make us more alive, not less." The elderly Japanese man nodded in agreement. "In Japan, we have a concept called ikigai, your reason for being. Sometimes tragedy helps us discover what truly matters. Perhaps your brother's illness is teaching you something about what it means to serve, to protect, to love." James looked around at these strangers who had become part of his story, who were offering wisdom born from their own experiences with loss and love. He thought about Tommy, probably watching television in his hospital bed right now, bored and scared and trying to be brave. What would Tommy think about this moment? He would probably be amazed that his big brother had broken protocol to help someone, that a simple act of kindness had created this community of caring strangers. "You know what?" James said, his voice growing stronger. "Tommy would love this story. He's always believed that the best things happen when you stop following the script and start following your heart. When I finally get to visit him, I'm going to tell him about today, about all of you, about how sometimes being a good soldier means being a good human being first." Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she had felt in months. "And I'm going to write about this in David's journal. I'm going to tell him about the brave young guard who reminded me that kindness is never a mistake, and about all the beautiful people who proved that strangers can become family in a single moment." The crowd around them erupted in spontaneous applause, but this time James didn't feel embarrassed by the attention. He felt proud, not just of his military service, but of the choice he had made to put humanity before protocol, connection before conformity. News of the encounter between Margaret and James spread far beyond the courtyard of Buckingham Palace that day. In an age where viral moments often celebrated conflict or embarrassment, this story offered something different. Genuine human. Connection that transcended cultural barriers and reminded people of their shared humanity. Sarah, the hospice nurse who had been part of the crowd, couldn't stop thinking about what she had witnessed. When she arrived at work for her next shift, she told her colleagues about Margaret and James. The story resonated deeply in a place where staff members spent their days helping families navigate loss and grief. "You know what struck me most?" Sarah told her supervisor. "It wasn't just that the guard helped her, though that was beautiful. It was how quickly strangers became a community when they recognized someone's pain. We see that here sometimes, families supporting each other in the waiting room. But this was different. These people had no obligation to each other except their shared humanity." Meanwhile, Margaret returned to her hotel room that evening feeling transformed. For months, she had been going through the motions of living while feeling dead inside. But the events at Buckingham Palace had awakened something in her that she thought she had lost forever. The ability to connect with others, to find meaning in unexpected places, to believe that David's spirit lived on in acts of kindness and moments of grace. She opened David's travel journal and began to write, her hand steady for the first time since his death. "My dearest David," she began, "today I learned something important about grief and love. I learned that carrying your memory doesn't have to be a burden that isolates me from the world. It can be a bridge that connects me to others who understand loss, hope, and the preciousness of human connection." She wrote about James, about his worry for his brother, about the way his eyes had lit up when she suggested that love wasn't just about physical presence. She wrote about Carmen and her grandmother's ashes, about the Japanese gentleman's wisdom about ikigai, about the veteran who had defended James's choice to break protocol in service of something more important than rules. "I think I understand now why you wanted us to travel," she continued writing. It wasn't really about seeing famous places or checking items off a bucket list. It was about opening ourselves to experiences that remind us how connected we all are, how similar our deepest hopes and fears really are, regardless of where we come from or what language we speak. Back at the barracks, James was facing the consequences of his actions. His commanding officer, Colonel Richardson, had summoned him for what James expected would be a severe reprimand. Breaking position during a ceremony was a serious breach of protocol, and James knew he might face disciplinary action that could affect his entire military career. "Guardsman Mitchell," Colonel Richardson began, his voice stern but not unkind. "What you did today was completely against regulations. You understand this, I assume?" "Yes, sir," James replied, standing at attention. "I accept full responsibility for my actions." The colonel studied James for a long moment. "Tell me what you were thinking when you left your post." James had rehearsed his explanation during the march back to barracks, but standing before his commanding officer, the prepared words felt inadequate. Instead, he found himself speaking from his heart. "Sir, I saw someone in distress, and I couldn't stand by and watch her lose something precious. I know that's not an excuse for breaking protocol, but in that moment, helping her felt more important than following rules." Colonel Richardson was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the reports from the ceremony. Finally, he looked up at James. "Guardsman, in 30 years of military service, I've seen a lot of soldiers follow orders perfectly while missing the point of why we serve in the first place. The Royal Guard exists to protect and serve the crown, but ultimately we serve the people of this nation and the values they hold dear." James wasn't sure where this was leading, but the colonel's tone was less harsh than he had expected. "What you did today reminded everyone present that beneath these uniforms, we are human beings with the capacity for compassion and moral courage. You showed discretion in a difficult situation, and according to multiple witness reports, your actions brought honor to the Guard, not disgrace." James felt his heart skip a beat. "Sir?" Furthermore, the colonel continued, "I've received 7 phone calls this afternoon from members of Parliament, 4 calls from journalists wanting to write positive stories about the military, and approximately 30 emails from tourists who witnessed the event, all praising your conduct and asking me to commend you rather than punish you." The room fell silent as James processed this information. He had expected court-martial proceedings, not praise. "However," Colonel Richardson added, and James braced himself for the inevitable punishment, "I also received a call from someone else, a young man named Tommy Mitchell, who identified himself as your brother." James's composure cracked completely. "Tommy called? How did he even know what happened?" "Apparently, one of the tourists posted a video on social media that showed you helping the elderly woman. The story spread quickly, and your brother saw it. He called here specifically to tell me that what you did today was exactly what your grandmother would have wanted, and that he was prouder of you than he had ever been." Tears filled James's eyes as the colonel continued. "He also mentioned that he's responding well to his treatments, and that he can't wait to hear the whole story when you visit him next weekend. I've approved your leave request, by the way." James could barely speak. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." "One more thing, Guardsman. The woman you helped, Mrs. Chen, left something for you at the front desk." Colonel Richardson handed James an envelope with his name written in careful handwriting. James opened it to find a photograph, one of the pictures he had helped Margaret collect, showing her and David standing together in front of the palace during their previous visit 20 years earlier. On the back, she had written, "For James, thank you for showing me that love finds a way to continue even after loss. Your brother is lucky to have someone who understands that the greatest strength comes from an open heart. With gratitude and best wishes for Tommy's recovery. Margaret Chen." Also in the envelope was a note. "James, I'm flying home tomorrow, but I wanted you to know that today changed everything for me. I came to London feeling broken and alone, and I'm leaving with a renewed faith in human kindness, and a story that I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Please give Tommy my best wishes for his recovery, and tell him that his big brother is a true hero, not because he wears a uniform, but because he chooses compassion over conformity. Reading Margaret's words, James finally understood what his grandmother had tried to teach him and Tommy after their parents died. That real strength wasn't about being invulnerable, but about staying open to love and connection even when it made you vulnerable. The military had taught him discipline and duty, but Margaret had reminded him that true service sometimes meant choosing heart over hierarchy. That evening, James called Tommy from the barracks payphone, something he had been hesitant to do before, because he never knew what to say. How do you comfort someone facing cancer when you're trained to solve problems through action rather than words? But after his conversation with Margaret, he felt different about the distance between them. "Tommy," he said when his brother answered, "I saw the news story about what happened today, and I need you to know something. Everything I did today, I did because I learned it from watching you." "What do you mean?" Tommy's voice was weak from the treatments, but James could hear the smile in it. "You've always been the one who sees people, really sees them. Remember when we were kids and you befriended that homeless man everyone else ignored? Or when you spent your birthday money buying groceries for the elderly woman next door? You taught me that being strong doesn't mean being hard." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "James, watching that video made me cry happy tears for the first time since this all started. I was so proud to tell everyone here that the guard in the story was my big brother. But more than that, I was proud because you looked like yourself, not just like a soldier following orders." Their conversation lasted 2 hours, the longest they had talked since Tommy's diagnosis. James told him about Margaret's story, about David's journal, about the community of strangers who had formed around a moment of kindness. Tommy shared stories from the hospital, about the other patients he had met, about the nurses who went above and beyond their duties to provide comfort as well as care. "You know what's funny?" Tommy said as they were ending the call. "I was so scared that being sick would make me weak, would make me less than I was before. But being here has shown me that vulnerability can make you stronger, not weaker. When you stop pretending you have everything under control, people can actually help you." 3 days later, Margaret was back in Vancouver, but the ripple effects of that day at Buckingham Palace continued to spread. She had written about her experience in a letter to the editor of her local newspaper, not seeking attention, but hoping her story might help other grieving people feel less alone. The letter was picked up by other papers, then by online news sites, and eventually by international media. But unlike many viral stories that flame out quickly, this one seemed to have staying power because it addressed something people were hungry for: authentic human connection in an increasingly digital and divided world. Margaret started receiving letters and emails from people around the world sharing their own stories of unexpected kindness, of strangers who had helped them through difficult times, of moments when someone's compassion had changed their perspective on loss or hardship. A widow in Australia wrote about a bus driver who had waited while she gathered her scattered groceries after a fall. A widower in Germany described how a young cashier had patiently helped him figure out how to use his smartphone to video call his grandchildren. A teenager in Japan told about an elderly woman who had sat with her at a train station when she was crying after her parents' divorce. "Your story reminded me that kindness is everywhere," one letter read. "I had forgotten to look for it." Margaret realized that she had stumbled into something larger than her own grief journey. She had become part of a conversation about what it means to care for each other, to notice suffering, to choose connection over indifference. David would have been amazed by the response, she thought. He had always believed that teachers could learn as much from their students as they taught them. And now Margaret was discovering the same thing about grief, that in sharing her pain, she was learning how to heal. The story had also inspired changes at Buckingham Palace. Colonel Richardson had used the incident as a teaching moment for the guards. emphasizing that their role was not just ceremonial but representational of British values, including compassion, honor, and service to others. "Rules exist to guide us," he told the assembled guardsmen, "but wisdom lies in knowing when humanity transcends protocol." What Guardsman Mitchell did that day exemplified the best of what we strive to represent. A new informal policy emerged. Guards were encouraged to use their discretion in situations involving genuine distress, understanding that sometimes the most professional response was also the most human one. The change was subtle but significant, acknowledging that the men and women in the iconic red coats were not just living statues, but representatives of values that included empathy and moral courage. 6 months later, Margaret Chen stood once again in the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, but this time she was not alone. Beside her stood her daughter Lisa and her 10-year-old granddaughter Emma, both of whom had insisted on joining her return trip to London. In her hands, she carried a new journal, one she had started after David's death, filled with stories of kindness and connection she had discovered in her widowhood. The crowds were just as thick as they had been on that transformative day. Tourists from around the world gathered to witness the changing of the guard ceremony. But Margaret felt different now, stronger, more present, more alive to the possibilities each day might bring. "Grandma," Emma whispered, tugging on Margaret's sleeve, "which one is the guard who helped you?" Margaret scanned the line of red-coated figures standing at attention. It had been months since that day, and she wasn't sure if James would still be posted here. Guard rotations changed regularly, and she had no way of knowing if he would be present today. But then she saw him. James stood in the same position where he had been 6 months earlier, his bearing as perfect and professional as ever. But Margaret noticed something different about him now. There was a lightness in his posture, a subtle warmth in his expression that hadn't been there before. What Margaret didn't know was that James had specifically requested to be on duty this day. He had seen the news coverage about Margaret's return visit to London, and something had compelled him to be here, to witness the completion of her journey back to joy. The past 6 months had brought tremendous changes to James's life as well. Tommy's treatments had been successful, and while the recovery was ongoing, the doctors were optimistic about his prognosis. More importantly, the relationship between the brothers had deepened through their shared experience of vulnerability and mutual support. James had learned to talk about his fears and worries instead of carrying them alone. Tommy had taught him that being strong for someone didn't mean pretending you weren't scared or sad. It meant being honest about your emotions while still showing up for the people you loved. The experience had also transformed James's approach to his military service. He had been promoted to Lance Corporal and had been chosen to help train new guards, partly because of his ability to balance military discipline with human compassion. His story with Margaret had become part of the informal training curriculum, an example of how to honor both duty and humanity. As the ceremony began, Margaret found herself watching not just the pageantry but the people around her. She noticed an elderly man struggling with his camera and quietly helped him adjust the settings. She smiled at a young mother whose toddler was getting restless and offered the child a small toy from her purse. She struck up conversations with other tourists, sharing recommendations for places to visit and genuinely enjoying the connections. Emma was fascinated by everything: the horses, the music, the elaborate uniforms. But she was most interested in the story her grandmother had told her about the kind guard who had helped save the photographs of Grandpa David. "Can we talk to him?" Emma asked eagerly. Margaret hesitated. She didn't want to disrupt James's duties or put him in an awkward position, but something about her granddaughter's innocent enthusiasm gave her courage. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Margaret approached the area where James stood. She waited until he was off duty and preparing to leave his post, then called out softly, "Guardsman Mitchell?" James turned, and his face lit up with genuine joy when he saw Margaret. "Mrs. Chen, I heard you were returning to London. How wonderful to see you again. James, I'd like you to meet my daughter Lisa and my granddaughter Emma. Girls, this is the young man I told you about. Emma stepped forward with the fearless curiosity of childhood. Are you the guard who saved my grandma's pictures of Grandpa? David? James knelt down to Emma's eye level. I am, and I'm very glad I was able to help your grandmother that day. Those photographs were very precious, weren't they? Grandma says you were brave to break the rules to help her, Emma said solemnly. My teacher says sometimes being good is more important than following rules. James smiled, thinking about how much this child reminded him of Tommy at that age, direct, wise beyond her years, unafraid to speak truth. Your teacher is very smart, and your grandmother taught me something important that day, too. What did she teach you? Emma asked. She taught me that caring for people is never a mistake, even when it's scary or difficult. She helped me understand how to be a better brother to someone I love very much. Margaret felt tears welling up, but they were tears of gratitude rather than grief. James, how is Tommy? I've thought about him often. He's doing much better. Thank you for asking. The treatments worked, and he's back at university now. Actually, he asked me to give you something if I ever saw you again. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He wrote this for you after he saw the news story about our meeting. He wanted you to know how your story inspired him during his recovery. Margaret opened the letter with trembling hands. In young, energetic handwriting, Tommy had written, Dear Mrs. Chin, you don't know me, but my brother James told me all about meeting you at Buckingham Palace. I wanted to thank you for showing him that it's okay to be vulnerable, that caring for people isn't weakness, but strength. When I was going through chemotherapy, there were days when I felt like giving up. But James would call me and tell me about the conversations you had, about how you were learning to carry your husband's memory as a source of strength rather than just sadness. Your example helped him help me. I'm writing this letter from my university dorm room, healthy and happy and grateful. Thank you for teaching my big brother that love never really ends. It just finds new ways to express itself. With admiration and gratitude, Tommy Mitchell. Margaret looked up from the letter to find that a small crowd had gathered around them, tourists who recognized her from the news stories and wanted to witness this reunion. But unlike the overwhelming attention, she had once feared, this felt warm and celebratory. Lisa stepped forward and hugged James impulsively. Thank you for helping my mother find her way back to joy, she said. For months after Dad died, I didn't think she would ever smile again. But that day here changed something fundamental in her. Emma tugged on James's sleeve again. My grandma says Grandpa David would have liked you very much. She says you have a kind heart, just like he did. James felt the familiar emotion rising in his throat, but now he didn't fight it. I think I would have liked him too, Emma. Anyone who loved your grandmother so much must have been a very special person. The gathered crowd began to applaud spontaneously, not because they were witnessing a performance, but because they were seeing something authentic and beautiful, the continuation of a story that had begun in grief and blossomed into hope. Margaret realized that this moment was exactly what David would have wanted for her, not to forget him or stop missing him, but to find ways to honor their love by creating new connections, by staying open to the unexpected gifts that life could still offer. As the applause died down, James made one final gesture that surprised everyone. He removed his military pin, a small but meaningful symbol of his service, and presented it to Emma. This is for you, he said, to remember that kindness is always brave, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply care about other people. Emma accepted the pin with wide-eyed wonder, understanding instinctively that she was receiving something precious. As Margaret, Lisa, and Emma walked away from Buckingham Palace that day, Margaret felt David's presence more strongly than she had since his death. not as an absence or a loss, but as a continuing love that expressed itself through moments like this, through the kindness of strangers who became friends, through the courage to reach out when someone was struggling, through the understanding. That connection and compassion were the most important gifts humans could offer each other. She opened the new journal and began to write. My dearest David, today I learned that our love story didn't end when you died. It just expanded to include more people, more kindness, more possibilities for grace. Thank you for teaching me to love so deeply that I couldn't help but find love everywhere I looked. The story of the tourist who hugged the royal guard. Though Margaret had never actually hugged James, the metaphor had taken on a life of its own, became more than just a viral moment. It became a reminder that in a world that often felt divided and disconnected, simple acts of human kindness could still bridge any gap, heal any wound, and transform any story from one of loss into one of love found in unexpected places.